Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Scott's Wrestling World Show. I'm your host, Scott Hubert. I am sorry for the hiatus. I have been on for the last month. I've been working pretty much almost every single day. Whenever I get home, I have no time to do shows because I got homework and school. But I'm back. Scott's Wrestling World is back on YouTube and wherever else you can find my video. And boy, do we have topics to discuss a little bit. We have the Hall of Fame coming up. WrestleMania 24 is next month. And I want to hype up real quickly, just so I don't forget about it, my next Scott's Wrestling World show. You're really going to want to check out. Because on Sunday, March 9th, we are going to Green Bay, Wisconsin, to the Resch Center to watch a Raw house show. And on that day, we're going to do a little bit of a voyage. A journey, if you will. We're going to go to a local promotion, the NWA Wisconsin offices. That is where the two guys, Hornswoggle and Mr. Kennedy, the only local promotion they ever worked for, that's where they came from, is NWA Wisconsin. Both those guys coming from Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I'm going to go there, and we're going to find out what it takes to get hooked up in a local promotion like thing. You know, I've got connections on the East Coast already with the Worldwide Wrestling Alliance. Good friends of mine. They're Dino Sano, a great guy. Jack Taylor, the announcer. He's a great announcer. He's done good things for me in the Scotch wrestling world, but I'm going to see what I can do locally, around here, and that's what we're going to do that day. And plus, on the outside, I'll try talking to some fans outside the Raw House Show, and I will give you a pre-show report standing outside the Resch Center, and then afterwards I'll tell you every single little thing that had happened, and we will try videotaping some of the wrestlers as they leave, and maybe we'll meet some of the wrestlers. So wouldn't that be a cool show to see? An on-location Scott's Wrestling World. Scott's Wrestling World hits the road next week, next show. Alright, to talk about, first thing I want to kick off with is mixed martial arts. Mixed martial arts is exploding. It's a great sport, and we had a great show this past Saturday at UFC 82 Pride of a Champion. That was the unification bout of Anderson Silva and Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson unifying the Pride middleweight title with the UFC middleweight title, which Anderson Silva has held and dominantly defended for quite some time. Now, to tell you the truth, Dan Henderson was our last hope at UFC 82 for quite some time to beat Anderson Silva. And I thought Dan Henderson could do it. I thought Dan Henderson could beat Anderson Silva. And boy, were we pretty much all wrong. You know, Anderson Silva and his previous title defenses, they're good matchups for him because Anderson Silva could beat those guys with his tie clinch and his strikes and what have you. But Dan Henderson has never been knocked out. He is an excellent takedown artist inside UFC, MMA, what have you. And, you know, Dan Henderson, in that fight, he took down Anderson Silva pretty much with ease. A little bit resistance, but, you know, you get my point. He took him down and he controlled the top of Anderson Silva for pretty much the entire first round. And then he comes out, and Anderson Silva was a little bit hesitant in that first round. And that kind of left Dan Henderson find his opening to take him down. Second round, Anderson Silva came out and was striking at Dan Henderson, almost knocking him out. Dan Henderson was woozy. And Dan Henderson was rear naked choked. Or a modified rear naked choke, what have you. It was not the full rear naked choke, because Dan Henderson pulled an arm away. But he still got choked with about 10, 15 seconds left in the bout. He tapped out. And Anderson Silva became the undisputed, if that's what you want to call it, middleweight champion, as he proved he is the #1 middleweight in the entire world. Anderson Silva, boy, I'll tell you what, he is a different kind of fighter. Who is going to beat Anderson Silva? I mean, watching the guy, I watched him in Pride, and this is what really baffles me, is that we have guys that come from Pride. Like what we had, we've had Crow Cop, Nogueira, Vanderlei, Shogun, and Henderson. And out of those four guys, that being Minotauro Nogueira, he wins the interim heavyweight title. Crow Cop loses 2 in a row. Vanderlei loses a very tough bout to Chuck Liddell, and Shogun gets submitted by an Ultimate Fighter. And Dan Henderson comes over, unifies both his belts that he had in Pride. And that's a huge accomplishment. Winning 2 belts at the same time in 2 different weight classes is a huge accomplishment for anybody. I don't care who you are, that's a huge accomplishment. But he comes over to the UFC, regarded as one of the best fighters and wrestlers in mixed martial arts today. Loses a decision to Quentin Jackson when he unified the light heavyweight titles. And then gets submitted in his second bout in the UFC when he unified his middleweight title. So you gotta imagine how Anderson Silva feels, right? I mean, Dan Henderson, how he feels right now. He's gotta be feeling pretty bad because he comes in the UFC. Not only does he lose his belts, but he has not won in the UFC yet. Dan Henderson has had such bad luck, and it's amazing. And what I'm saying on my point actually kind of right now is that Anderson Silva, I saw him. He sucked in Pride. He won fights. But he was not really a dominant fighter as compared to what he is here. Anderson Silva is nuts in the UFC. He has not lost yet. He beat down Chris Lieben, which I loved him for in his first bout. Second bout, he gets a title shot against Rich Franklin, who pretty much seemed indomitable. Nobody could beat the guy up. Makes a mockery of Rich Franklin. Beats Travis Lutter in a non-title bout. Beats Nate Quarry. Beats Rich Franklin. Now beats Dan Henderson. The guy is just on such a roll. It's amazing what this guy has done in the UFC compared to what he did in the Pride. And then like those 5 guys I mentioned that came over, other than Nogueira, they have all sucked. They're dominant fighters over in Pride, but they come to the UFC into the octagon and they get beaten up. And that's pretty amazing considering it's the debate for a long time. When Pride and UFC were together and mixed martial arts was really expanding, which fighters are more skilled? Pride fighters or UFC fighters? Everybody said Pride fighters because, really, Pride is, there's a few less restrictions than UFC does, like they allow kicks to the head when you're on the ground and some other things like that. They go longer rounds than the UFC does. Overall, it looked like they would be better fighters. But they come over here to the UFC, and everybody thinks, they're gonna dominate. Like when Crow Cop came over, I'll admit to you, when he came over, I'm like, you must just give this guy the heavyweight title right now on a silver platter. Nobody's gonna beat this guy. And he beat Eddie Sanchez in his first bout. His second bout, he gets knocked out by a head kick from Gabriel Gonzaga, and then he loses in his strike fest with Czech Congo. Loses a decision to Czech Congo last September. Who would have thunk that in Crow Cop's first 3 bouts, he would have gone 1-2. At best, at worst, I would have thought he'd go 2-1. But no, it was the other way around. 1-2. I mean, boy. And then Vanderlei, taking nothing away with Chuck Liddell. Vanderlei was a tough decision to Chuck. But everybody thought he could beat Chuck. Shogun gets submitted by an Ultimate Fighter. An Ultimate Fighter submits the best light heavyweight in the world. He was ranked number 1 when he came into the UFC. And that's what amazes me. He was ranked number 1. And he gets submitted by Forrest Griffin. Boy! And Dan Henderson, I just got done talking about him. So, I mean, really, the debate is closed now of what fighters were better, Pride or UFC. That debate is pretty much over, as we have found out the UFC guys have pretty much stopped your Pride guys. And that is pretty amazing. Heath Herring that night won a decision over Czech Congo. It was a great fight. Heath Herring, I see a lot of potential in him. He's a young guy. Been fighting for quite some time, but he's still only 29 years old. This guy has future heavyweight champion written all over him. I may not like the guy, but I can guarantee you that. He has heavyweight champion written all over him, and so does Congo. Both those guys, great futures in the UFC and the sport of mixed martial arts. A debate at UFC 82 was that Chris Lieben. Remember Chris Lieben? I'm pretty sure you do remember Chris Lieben. You remember him for being, a little prick. A little freaking 185 pounder you want to take and smash his freaking head into a wall. Excuse me. Because I can't stand the guy. He goes into the middleweight bout and he fights, Alessio Sakara, who's making his debut in middleweight. And Chris Lieben, both those guys are not ranked. And Chris Lieben went on a streak of losses and has recently just won a knockout decision over Terry Martin, I believe, before this fight. And Alessio Sakara and Chris Lieben bump Josh Koscheck in his fight, and then even Diego Sanchez in his fight. Even Andrei Arlovsky's fight was bumped to the prelims because of Chris Lieben and Alessio Sakara were on the main card, and they weren't just the first match. They were the third match in the card. They were the middle match. You know how much it disgusted so many mixed martial arts fans, UFC fans? If you were not disgusted by that, you should be beaten over the